Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. My name is Sean Lubiak. I'm a third-year PhD candidate here at Souza, and it's a privilege to present to you guys Dr. Souza. He's an associate professor at the University of Tampa. And prior to him landing that role, the whole degrees at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, he's done a lot of stuff with molecular response current training, as well as periodization. And it's really unique about him. Even though he's at a teaching school, he's really productive with people. Innovation Index is 28, he's working inside over 3,000. Very good there. One of the things that I really admire about Dr. Souza outside of his research is the ability to kind of bridge the gap between really complex things, whether it be nitty-gritty physiology or really complex study design, and get a really good practical application. I know that from firsthand because I was an undergraduate and master's student at the University of Tampa, and I've been working with him for quite some time, just as a student and then seeing him in the lab and stuff like that. And I just really admire him in terms of his ability to do that. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it off to Dr. Souza so he can give his talk. And I'm going to give you this over here. If you guys are in class, you need to sign in.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for a very nice introduction, Sean. I'm going to Vim you later, okay? Don't, yeah. I feel honored and humbled to be here. I have so much respect for this institution. I keep learning from this amazing team of faculty and everything they do for the students. Again, really appreciate of the opportunity, okay, guys? The conversation today is going to be about training volume and the quest for muscle growth. Do meta-analysis close the case? Is something, that topic, that dose-response relationship when it comes to training volume and how that impacts muscle growth, aka hypertrophy, is something I have been studying for pretty much the last, I don't know, I'm not going to give up my age, right? So the full disclosure, I have no conflict of interest whatsoever. I'm not affiliated for any company. I don't benefit financially for any perspective or claim I'm going to make here, okay? Maybe the only thing I need to disclose, yes, I'm not that articulated, I'm not funny, and the person who made the shirt for me was gracious enough to put that I know my shit. I'm gonna keep pretending, okay? So I hope I don't let you down. So that's a topic for today, the layout for today. Basically definition about what training volume is. Training volume effects on protein synthesis and muscle growth. We need to talk about persistent issues in our field. And again, I'm quite optimistic about the field, but regardless, if you want to be an evidence-based physiotherapist, if you want to be an evidence-based strength coach or researcher, the critical appraisal of the literature is vital for what we do. It's vital for decision-making process, it's vital for formulating new hypotheses and developing new studies. So again, I always like to remind that's not about people when you are critiquing, appraising the evidence. It's about the merit of the information and the merit of the evidence, okay? But we need to touch on those persistent issues we have in our field. Our studies are underpowered and they fail to be replicated. That's something important, especially when all those studies go into a meta-study, meta-regression, or a meta-analysis, okay? Discuss the evidence-based pyramid. You probably saw that from 1995 for evidence-based medicine, and discuss some proposal changes and how we should approach meta-analysis in our field. Then you're going to do a brief historical analysis of training volume meta-analysis published in our field, starting with Schoenfeld, 2016, Basvali, and Pelland, which is still a preprint, but it came out last year. And the take-home message, and then you can vote whether or not the meta-analysis closed the case, okay? That's pretty much the conversation for today. So simply put, when you talk about training volume, you talk about the exercise dosage, how much exercise someone is doing. So a simple way to understand volume is about that, the exercise dosage. And we can define that in different ways. Total number of reps performed per exercise, session, week, or the entire training program. We can talk about total number of sets per exercise, session, week, or the entire training program. And I highlighted in red weekly sets per muscle group. Pretty much since the Schoenfeld meta-analysis in 2016, almost 10 years, we are referring to training volume at the weekly set number per muscle group. So I'm gonna call your attention when you talk about sets per exercise, but most of my talk is gonna be about weekly sets per muscle group. We do have the total training volume or the volume load, which is a product of sets times reps times load on the barbell. That's not a prescription variable or metric. We don't go like, today I'm gonna hit 10,000 for my leg day, right? Not gonna do 10,000 pounds. But it's an important metric when it comes to tracking progression, monitoring fatigue, or important confounding variable when you're doing studies, okay? So we also have the training volume bands or categories. We can define, separate that in 3 categories. What is called low volume, everything that's below 12 weekly sets for a given muscle group. Again, I talk about for a given muscle group. We have the moderate volume band, the 12 to 20 weekly sets per muscle group. And everything that's performed above 20 weekly sets for a muscle group, we call that as high training volume, okay? So we all know that to muscle mass accretion take place and producing the increase in muscle size, protein synthesis must outweigh breakdown. 24/7, your body is building and degrading protein. When you have the positive net protein balance, muscle you grow. So we here look at a study from Bird, 2010, with a trained individuals. They pretty much compare 1 set versus 3 sets. Very interesting that, again, not quite interesting, that was expected. The total training volume was higher for 3 sets. But when you look at protein synthesis responses, both conditions increased protein synthesis 5 hours post-intervention, but only the 3 sets condition increased or kept protein synthesis elevated 29 hours post. And again, that's important and showing that only multiple sets compared to single sets was able to sustain protein synthetic response all the way to 29 hours post-exercise. And that was greater compared to 1 single set at 5 and 29 hours post-intervention. So that's one of the first meta-analyses we had in our field by Krieger. And here, the outcome is hypertrophy, but you talk about sets per exercise, okay? So we can see that single set produces muscle growth. And I think a few things we agree about this topic. Yes, you can grow substantial, you can produce substantial muscle growth with low volume. And we all agree that multiple sets are better than single sets. It gets a little the gray area when you start to talk about moderate to high volumes, which we're gonna discuss that later. But as you can see, the effect for multiple sets was greater compared to single sets. We didn't have as many studies in 2010. We see a dose-response relationship. So again, multiple sets better than single sets, but nothing stood out when they compare 2-3 sets per exercise versus 4-6 sets. We might talk about type 2 arrow. They didn't have as many studies, not too much power back in 2010. But again, we can grow muscle with a low volume. And I think that's something, I might be mistaken, but I think we all agree that multiple sets are better than single sets. So, and then we need to talk about the quest for significance in our field. And I always think that the push should be for methodological rigor and replication, but we have way more studies with a positive results. Whoever here got no effect, no differences, You know how difficult it is to publish that study, and that might skew our view about a given outcome, okay? So it's always important to remind everyone that the studies we do, they are overall underpowered. We don't have a sufficient power to detect an effect, assuming the alternative hypothesis is true, but don't need to bother about that. And another important thing when it comes to our studies, they are short in duration. And that produces what you call the snapshot fallacy. When people are going to generalize findings beyond study duration. So again, studies are overpowered and they are quite short when you think about the big scheme of for how long an athlete or a trainee is going to perform exercise. And you're probably aware of the largest replication project in our field. That was the first one, it's still the largest. But again, interesting findings that only 28% of the studies replicated the original results. So we talk about that when they replicated the studies in our field, only 1 out of 3 was significant as the former study. So only 1 out of 3 replicated. And another issue with, again, when you have underpowered studies, we have unstable estimates. And that's the case for the effect sizes. 88% of effect sizes were smaller. The median drop, 75%. So again, only 1 out of 3 replicated was significant. But when you look at the effect sizes, the magnitude of the effect, the median drop was 75%. And what is the consequence, right? That might lead to misleading conclusions when you talk about training volume or any other topic, because those studies going to be analyzed in the meta study or in the meta regression. So another issue, you probably wonder why the studies findings in our field don't match. I think there's something else explaining. We still need to advance when it comes to training status. We need to advance about the measurement technique per se. But when you have a very small studies, we are also dealing with what we call sampling variance. So we cannot study the whole population. We're going to use sampling techniques to get X number of participants. And when you have underpowered studies, that study might not be representative of the whole population. So that's the issues that we are facing at this point. Again, I'm still optimistic. I think we're doing better and better. But those are the things we need to keep in mind when you are praising literature for decision-making process with a patient or for designing a new study. And why our field loves meta-analysis, or why we rely so heavily on meta-analysis. And again, nothing against meta-analysis. I think they are a great tool. So one problem is the statistical power, right? We get a greater statistical power when you are doing meta-analysis. In the study, the former slide, there was talk about the largest replication project. Average sample size was 17 per study. Meta-analysis, we talk about 1,000 participants, 2,000 participants. So we have a greater statistical power. We can detect tiny differences. That's something we're going to talk about. Are those tiny differences meaningful? Do they have a clinical significance? That's another important thing for any practitioner if you want to be evidence-based. The difference between statistical significance and the difference for clinical significance, okay? So we can have a more precise estimate because you are aggregating more and more data. We can reconcile those conflicting findings. That's why the studies don't agree in our field. And overall, we can have a broader insights about a given topic and ideally propose better results down the line or better studies down the line. Yes, our field loves meta-analysis, and this is from 2023. And the quote from the greatest Uncle Ben. I love Marvel and Spider-Man, and I love this title. So very interesting that, gonna quote unquote the authors here, we identified statistical errors in 85 of the 20 most highly cited meta-analyses in the strength and conditional research over the past 20 years. Never do math in public, but I can do that, right? 85 out of 20, 17 studies out of 20 contained statistical error. Good thing though, only 2 about hypertrophy, okay? So only 2 of, I checked the studies, only 2, and simple stuff like using standard error to compute effect sizes rather than standard deviation. Not being able to weight studies properly when the small studies can be more influential, changing the whole landscape. So basic stuff, and 17 out of 20 meta-analysis strength conditioning field contained simple statistical error. So you all probably familiar with the pyramid of evidence, the hierarchy for the studies in our field. We see meta-analysis sitting on the top, followed by randomized controlled trial, cohort studies, case control studies, case series reports. Important question, do you see opinion over there? Anyone, do you see opinion? No opinion, right? Opinion is not evidence, even mine, okay? My opinion is not evidence. So, and I love this paper by Murad. He proposed kind of adapt the pyramid for evidence for a few reasons, right? The first question is like, do meta-analysis really belong at the top of evidence pyramid? And why the question was that? Because, like I said, when the body of the literature is robust, is strong, meta-analysis, yes, 100%, they can clarify the evidence. But when the body of the literature is not quite robust, meta-analysis will amplify weaknesses. Not all RCT I create equal, and the same applies for meta-analysis. You can have a cohort study, retrospective, prospective, is stronger than an underpowered RCT. And you have a meta-analysis that pretty much contains studies with a low quality. Like I said, that's going to amplify the weaknesses in our field. So what they proposed was that more wave format, because like I said, not every study is created equal. So depending on the quality of the study, like I said, yes, cohort studies, we can't establish causality, but they can provide even more, even stronger evidence compared to an underpowered, not well done RCT. And in this model, they propose the more wavy format between the studies within our field. But what I loved about that, they chopped off meta-analysis from the top, and they are used as a lens to evaluate the evidence up to the point it was published. If you follow me, you don't need to follow me, right? But you know I keep saying that. Meta-analysis, they do not provide definitive answer about anything. They have an expiration date. And again, they have an expiration date. That's something you need to keep in mind about meta-analysis. And is an invite to look at literature up to the point it was published. So that's why I love this model. And we don't see that very often. We chop off meta-analysis from the top of evidence pyramid and use meta-analysis as a lens to evaluate the field and see where we can do better. And talk about meta-analysis in our field, we have pretty much the 3 meta-analysis that I told you. We would do a quick historical review. Pointed out the caveats here, again, is always about the merit of the evidence and the things. Sometimes you hear something on social media that's way different from the studies. It's our job as thinkers of our field to clarify and show what can we say or not about certain studies or findings, okay? So the 3 meta about training volume, going back to the dose-response relationship, we are talking about Brad Schofield meta from 2016. We'll talk about Basvali et al. From 2022, and the one that made the rounds on social media from Pallant et al. From Dr. Zurdo's lab. It's still in preprint. It came out last year. So there is another one, but again, kudos for these guys. They were super transparent. You can download analysis. You can download extracted data. You can see what studies were included. And they have another meta regression with number of sets per session. I'm not going to talk about that one because pretty much the same data set. The only difference is about sessions, weekly number of sets per session. And the one I'm going to discuss to keep consistent to what I told you is about weekly sets number, okay? All right. The Meta from Schoff and colleagues. So first thing to keep in mind here, in 2016, we didn't have as many studies we have today. And Brad also included studies with body composition parameters. Again, if you work for ultrasound or MRI, every time you measure muscle size, the unit is going to be millimeters, centimeters, inches, depending on how many dimensions, right? Squared, cubic. But that's a measurement of muscle size. If you work for DEXA or body pod, the unit is grams, pounds. So I just tell you that fat-free mass, in my opinion, can be a proxy of a muscle hypertrophy, but muscle hypertrophy is a measurement of muscle size, whereas fat-free mass is a component of body composition. And the magnitude of change and the magnitude of the effect is different when you're looking at ultrasound versus fat-free mass measurements, okay? And again, they had 17 studies. They included 40 studies with body composition parameters. Was kind of quite divided, about half trained individuals, the other half was untrained. And the first forest plot, right, each study produces an estimate, and then we can see the overall effect. So going towards to the left, we have the effect favoring the low volume. Going towards to the right, we have the effect favoring the high volume. We have a 0, the null estimate, and you have the confidence interval for that effect. Bottom line is what they found, a significant effect favoring high volume compared to low. Low volume here was everything below 5 sets. Everything above 5, when they did a study, was considered the high volume, okay? So what else you can see here is the effect significant, but it's quite small. Not trivial, but 0.24 effect size is a small effect, but significant effect favoring high volume. But I highlight this little guy here and need to talk about him because you can see that, or this guy, or this estimate, right? You need to talk about it, and we will in the next slide. You can see that estimate stands out compared to all the other estimates that were analyzed. So we're gonna go back and talk about that. So they also did a categorical analysis, kind of looking at what is the effect up to 5, what is the effect when you're looking at 5 to 9 sets, and what is the effect above 10 sets. I don't know if you recall that, but there was a meta-analysis that not everyone, right, it's too many people, but a lot of people started to say that if you want to max out muscle growth, you got to do more than 10 sets. In my opinion, this meta-analysis does not support that. And I'm going to try to show why, okay? So as you can see, for each additional set, we have a small effect size, no surprises. The confidence interval for that, no estimate, so it's significant, significant effect. But let's focus on the 5 to 9 effect, was 0.37 versus 0.52 for doing more than 10 sets. When you see the confidence intervals, they never compare between conditions. You're just looking at within conditions. So we can see a considerable overlapping for doing more than 10 sets and doing 5 to 9. So again, just looking at that, we can see they look very, very similar. But it gets more interesting when they did what you call sensitivity analysis. There are guidelines for conducting systematic reviews and meta-analysis, and that's an important part of the process. When you're gonna run multiple analysis, removing one study at once, and then you're gonna be able to find if one study is influential. And that estimate I show you was found to be influential. So that only that, because again, not too many studies, not too much power. In that case, one unusual observation might skew your results. That's what they found here. So now, when we look at the effects without the influential study, things look a little smaller, but 5 to 9 effect size was 0.41, and plus 10 sets was pretty much the same exact effect size. So they never compare 5 to 9 versus plus 10 sets. We don't have any comparison to say A is different from B, but based on within condition analysis, they pretty much look the same. Their confidence interval for that effect, if you pay attention, is very much the same as well. 5 to 9 and plus 10 sets. And even if you look like a below 5, there is a considerable overlapping between the confidence interval for the effect sizes. So again, this meta does not support that doing more than 10 sets is better than 5 to 9. And the authors, they mentioned in the paper that we didn't have as many studies above 12 sets. So they highlighted, they mentioned uncertainty surrounding that effect. So again, we could have put too much stock in that finding, not for lack of quality, because 5 to 9 and doing more than 10 sets, they look very much the same. And I forgot to tell you, that was the equivalent percentage gain per set. Every set that was added, there was the equivalent percentage gain, 0.25 versus 0.37 when they removed one study that was found to be influential. And that is the systematic review from Basvali. And again, people, read beyond the abstract. Because if you're gonna pay attention here, right, the final sentence, according to the results of this review, a range of 12 to 20 weekly sets per muscle group might be an optimal standard recommendation for increasing muscle hypertrophy in young trained men. First, the word optimal gives me chills. And the sentence before, I'm struggling here with the sentence before, they show that 3 muscles they analyzed, only one was different, but we need to talk about that as well. So there are so many cool things they did here, okay? Several things they tried, I really like it, but also those things kind of hurt their statistical power. So what they did here was, first, only included studies with direct measurement. Muscle thickness, cross-sectional area via MRI, so only direct assessments, not body composition assessments. They only included trained individuals, only trained cohort here was analyzed, okay? And they did a categorical per volume band. They mentioned the low volume below 12, the moderate volume 12 to 20, and also the high volume above 20, but they only show comparison between moderate and high. Something else they did was interesting, but kind of hurt their statistical power, was analyzing the data per muscle group. Again, when you aggregate all the studies together and you compute the standardized differences, you have more power. But what they want to do here was, what about when you look quads muscle, biceps, and triceps? Again, if you look at the top for quadriceps, we can see that it's slightly favoring the high volume versus moderate, but that effect crosses 0. We can say the uncertainty is big here. We can't say that high volume was better than moderate with a lot of confidence. Same scenario with an even higher uncertainty when they look at biceps. So again, they pretty much separate for quadriceps muscle, biceps, and triceps. And when they look at quadriceps muscles and the biceps, no differences there. The only difference they found was for triceps. But guess who is there again? That study that was found to be influential. So that study per se could shift the whole analysis there. And important things that, like I said, when you're going to conduct systematic reviews with a meta-analysis, there are guidelines for that. Pre-registration is how we started. So they didn't do any pre-registration for that. And they also didn't conduct any sensitivity analysis or publication bias analysis. Because if they do that over there for the triceps, the outcome would be similar to what we saw for Schoenfeld. Because that study has a huge effect size. That study was influential in the previous meta-analysis with more studies, and now it will be influential here with a fewer studies, 100%. But again, a lot of cool stuff here, but this meta-analysis or systematic review does not support that high is better than moderate volume. If you want to be positive, yeah, it does for one muscle out of two with a huge uncertainty. And we have the famous meta-regression that came out last year by Pallant and colleagues, again, from Dr. Zuder's lab. So overall, they include 2,000 participants. You see, now I have a lot of power to detect tiny, tiny differences. 2,000 people. It's a lot of people. So a lot of things they also did a different, which I like. Again, I forgot to tell you that meta-analysis, they're also constrained by not just for the data we are including, but also for the scientific choices made by researchers, okay? So what they did here, only direct measurement. So only direct measurement, they decided to analyze volume as a continuous variable, not as a category variable, as Schoenfeld and Basvali did. They did a categories, now they look at volume as a continuous variable, which makes sense when they have a large data set, okay? And they also use a Bayesian approach. We don't need to dive about Bayesian, the beef between frequentist and Bayesian analysis, they are different. We have a hybrid models combining both nowadays too. But again, a lot of things they did here were different and quite interesting. So I'm gonna call your attention here because the data set for hypertrophy was different. Was not the 2,000 people, not the 60, 70 studies. They used pretty much 35 studies for the hypertrophy data set. The median values for hypertrophy data set was 10.5 sets per week. That's telling us that the half of the studies included had a weekly set number below 10.5. And you can see over there, if you just draw a line at number 10, weekly sets, you can see that half of the studies was below 10. And again, we didn't have as many studies over 25, which the authors noticed in their paper. So they noticed that, yes, we use a Bayesian model, but we didn't have as many studies about 25 weekly sets. They tried to do something here. So what they did was they counted indirect sets. So think about that. If you're doing 5 sets for your triceps, that would count as 5 direct sets for your triceps. But if in your program, you're doing 5 sets off a bench, they counted each set as a half. So any study that had, if a study only had a triceps, 5 sets for triceps. But if a study had 5 sets for bench, 0.5 each, that's 2.5, plus 5 sets for triceps, that would be 7.5 in the fractional counting method. They use a fractional counting to pretty much, again, increase the number of estimates with a higher number of sets. So again, they did the indirect counting. Is arbitrary? In my opinion, I think we all agree that, yes, if you do lat pull down, it does something for your biceps. But if I do pull-ups or chin-ups, it's the same. Is 0.5 the same across the board? Again, I appreciate they did that because we all agree that, yes, it does something. But the data is not there yet when you compare the studies analyzing the effect of compound movements on synergist muscles, like a lat, pull down, and the effect on biceps or bench, and the effects on triceps. The data is not there yet. But was a decision they made. It has logical and physiological plausibility, in my opinion, but that's something we as a scientist, we need to advance and discuss more. The findings. You look at the dose-response relationship. Oh my gosh. You look at the dose-response relationship. I'm struggling for the thing here. You look at the dose-response relationship. The thick blue line represents the estimated mean. And as you can see, as a function of increasing number of sets, hypertrophy response, the curve actually never levels off. So they found a linear relationship with important diminishing returns, especially after 20 weekly sets. For every set that was added, the benefit got smaller and smaller. But we can see the curve gets quite steeper up to 10 sets, right? So if you draw a line here, the curve got quite steeper after 10 sets. The curve never levels off. That's why a lot of people start to say, more is better. If you want to gain more muscle, more is better. But like I said, after 20 weekly sets, the diminishing returns increase considerably, that each additional set bring a very, very small effect, okay? However, going back again, the difference between what is statistical significance. We cannot talk about statistical significance here because it was a Bayesian analysis. We talk more about what the estimate would likely to be. Going close to 1, okay, close to 0, thumbs down, okay? But what they found here, and you can download the data, they did a multiple comparison between 1 and 2, 1 and 3, all the way to 45, so on and so forth. And they established 2% as the smallest detectable effect size. So everything above, everything that surpassed 2% would be meaningful muscle hypertrophy. Yes, I like your face because I had the same issue too. So what we can see, and nobody told about that after 30 sets per week, assuming what they established as the smaller detectable difference, after 30 sets per week, that additional gain is not meaningful. It has no practical relevance. It did not surpass 2%. And that's another thing I didn't agree with their choice. 2%, when you look at the studies included, consider my experience, 2% is comparative for measurement error across several studies. We not talk about coefficient variation, we talk about percentage. So if you go by 4%, which is reasonable, if you assume like a measurement error 4%, would you say that above 20 weekly sets, no minimal hypertrophy, although the curve never leveled off? What I'm telling here, guys, we can't dissociate minimal detectable difference, small effect size of interest from measurement error. And don't be delusional that meta-analysis will fix measurement error, because measurement error is a combination of a random and systematic. For random error, yes, meta-analysis might cancel off each study, each other. But for systematic, we got to do that explicitly, and we're not there yet. They did a moderate analysis, which from a statistical standpoint is tricky as well. And what they found here was, again, good for formulating hypotheses. They stated that in the paper. But when they compare trained versus untrained, untrained people benefit the double from adding sets compared to trained individuals. No surprises, right? Diminishing returns is real. You get more and more trained. You get less and less adaptations. And fiber versus whole muscle. They also included, I measure fiber in my PhD, in my master's studies as well. The variation is way higher than muscle thickness or cross-sectional area. And as you can see, the effect also is way larger. We also know that fibers grow way more when you measure thickness or cross-sectional area. And almost there, since the meta regression, we have those 4 papers published from my lab. Here we had one group maintaining the volume, other 2 increasing 30 and 60%. On average, you talk about 12, 20, 25 weekly sets, no differences. From Dr. Buckner, comparing high and low, but we must say that high and low here was in the low volume band. The high volume, I think, never did more than 12 weekly sets. No differences as well. The study we did in collaboration with Alison, the author from the infamous 52 weekly sets, we found something for favoring high volume for women. And the study from Zach Robson, one of the co-authors from the meta-analysis, was more about looking at individual responses, but they use a volume to do that. I haven't read the paper, but when they look at the figure they're comparing 8 sets versus 16, I don't know what their conclusions were, but the no estimate, 0, is in the credible interval, okay? So again, we don't have a certainty to talk about differences between 16 and 8 weekly sets. Yeah, real quick to wrap this up, guys. Volume is important. It's an important variable, but in my opinion, we're still scratching surface. You are studying the dose-response relationship in the very specific conditions when it comes to exercise selection, muscles measured. So for that 35 studies, only 1 study for pec, 1 for hamstring, and 1 for trap. All the rest, quads, elbow flexor, elbow extensors. So we need to advance more here. Oh, not there yet. Jesus Christ. Like I said, meta-analyses are constrained by studies included and scientific choices made by researchers. So quality, design type, consistency of the studies will dictate the outcome for a meta-analysis or meta-regression. We need to advance more about trained and untrained. The studies I did in my lab, probably the strongest cohort, and we never found differences between high and moderate volumes. Like I said, we don't have as many studies going above 25 weekly sets. And when you compute all that in the meta-analysis, we're still inflating uncertainty at this point. And like I said, in my opinion, the case isn't closed because we need to start incorporate measurement error in meta-analysis and to have a better understanding about what the true effect is. Does that effect surpass measurement error? Again, 2% they used, in my opinion, is comparable for most of studies included measurement error. Now, Sean, if you can help me, we can vote. That's the last slide, I swear. I don't want to put any bias on you, okay? I hope I didn't, but more always better. Did the meta-analysis close the case? All right, raise your hand if your vote is yes. Oh my. 0. All right, now I gotta count, okay? Raise your hand if you think that the answer is no. You can count abstentions too. How? Too many? How many you have? Okay. Too many. I can't count. I'm pretty bad for basic math. Although for helping Antonio with a 7th grade math. I'm struggling too. It's like they teach in a different way. I hope you like, guys. I just came here to share some of the questions that inside my head for a while and reflection about this topic. Again, we as a scientist, we can't be delusional. We understand something at this point, especially in exercise science field. That's not black and white. That's a beauty, what we do working for humans, right? It's not like a math, but I hope you enjoy it. Thank you once more for inviting me and the opportunity.
Any questions?
Don't be scared or shy, don't bite. Go ahead. Great question. So when we look at their supplemental material, we can see that they reported intra-subject design with a parallel group design. So when you have like a two groups separate and then compared to intra-subjects that each leg or arm does high or low. We had an interesting study. We are working on that. 12 weeks, 18 sets. We have a trained, middle-aged, almost elderly women. And after it's 24 weeks long. After I'm collaborating for that project. And after 12 weeks, one group, one leg kept 18, the other double, 36. 3 measurements. There is something favoring high volume for one, not for two. I think intra-subject design is the way to go about this. You have a less noisy, less biological variability. So I think that would be my take about the design type. Yes. Man, that's a great question as well. I know Hadeli, great guy. I think he's in Portugal now. He's from Brazil too. They were like a Navy Brazilian. Not that they don't do a lot of strength training. They didn't back then. I think the novice effect, the novelty, could have played a role because we see that's something I told you that yes, the sampling variance might explain a lot of the differences between studies, but we see studies with individuals that are weaker or not so trained, the effect usually is larger. They accounted, again, they accounted for that the way they did the Meta-Analyses. They weight exercise, the individual studies in the proper way to avoid that. But I think that the novelty could be a reason for that. Yep. No, great question. We have 2 studies with actual outcomes for hypertrophy. I'm gonna say that. So one study was conducted for someone that was very often on social media saying that you don't need isolation. The only thing you need is compound. And they found comparable muscle growth for the compound movement. The other group that say the opposite and doesn't share the same perspective did a study comparing and they found isolation was better. I would love to see a study outside those 2 groups and see, but I totally agree for you, like is when you're gonna use 0.5, 0.25, 0.75. For me, if I go for chin-ups, that might be maybe 0.75. When I go lat pull down, might be 0.5 or 0.40. It's just, again, I understand why they did that. Was good for the model. There is, again, logical and physiological plausibility, but that's a question. We don't have an answer. We need to advance to be able to count indirect sets properly. How many? And again, like I was teaching the summer, like even for nursing, we have 80% of the decision makes process. We don't have evidence for exercise science. That number might be even worse. We all know that lat pull down, great exercise for lats. We don't have one study compare lat pull down to chin ups and look at hypertrophy, for example. We have a long way to go. Getting better, but there's so many studies we need and replication. Again, we got to have a push for methodological rigor and replication Because when you start to replicate, think about that. It's like flipping a coin. If I flip only 5 times, I get 4 out of 5. That's 80% heads. That's a biased sample. If you keep flipping, you have a more estimate close to the truth. So that's why you need way more studies in our field.
I know you said that most of the studies have to measuring of the sets to see hypertrophy. How did they standardize like load? Did they give them a comparative load, or did they compare them like rating for each big version?
That's a good question. So it's right here. That's great. So out of the studies included, so we have most of studies going all the way to failure. When I do studies in my lab, like I don't think that's ecologically valid. I don't know trainees that go every set to failure. So we go 2 R&R and the last one to failure, and use that one to gauge, like is the guy really 2 R&R? But most of studies was perform every set to failure for a given rep range. I think the rep range is right there. Mixed, like I do. And I can say most of studies, 2 R&R, failure, some studies, no failure. And that's, again, it's something we got to do better, standardized in our field. But yeah, that's a good question. Go ahead.
Minimum amount of exercise needed just for me.
I love this question. Go ahead, go ahead.
Or off of the same studies or happening?
At this point, and again, like considering the Josh Pallant meta regression, they found that the minimum effective dosage for hypertrophy would be 4 sets per week. That probably that adds muscle. I'm very confident that would work for maintenance as well. We did studies in the lab when I was in Brazil that we reduced volume by 60 and 40%, and have people training once or twice. They have like a regular training 8 weeks, then we reduce the volume for the next 8 weeks. They preserve the muscle as well. Because again, we all like talk about science, maximize muscle growth, but overall, the biggest pandemic is people being sedentary, and time is the biggest constraint. And when you talk about, hey, you can get, I always talk about that when teaching students, like I'm not a big fan of the recommendation 3 times per week exercise, because one, from philosophical, mathematical, one is way different from 0. When you do coding, right, they're dichotomic. 1 is one thing, 0 is another thing. So again, I think we gotta push more for the minimal effect dosage based on that data. And then we gotta consider the studies that were included. The duration was about 10 weeks and a half. 4 weekly sets would work for maintenance. We have a new studies. We gotta keep updating. Again, meta-analyses are great tools, guys. Like I said, tools for analyze the field up to the point the meta was published. They expire at this point based on what they showed us. 4 weekly sets would work that 100%. Go ahead.
Chat on Texas. So typically, the one study mentioned women on more favor of higher volume. How do that curve of weekly sets per net? They have the same transition point and 1 set.
That's a good question as well. For Pallant and Schoenfeld, when they did the moderate analysis, no differences. So for the time the studies were conducted, for the characteristics of studies included, Schoenfeld and Pallant. If you go for Pallant, if you go for the supplemental material, no differences. The men gain more in absolute terms because they have a more, but the pattern is no difference.
I have a question.
Yeah.
One of the things you were thinking about topics straight away, slightly different question. One of the things you brought up, I noticed work on, things you ran on social media about a little bit, is swelling. So swelling for the last training session, influencing the outcome. you just kind of broadly speak to that topic and where the field is on that?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, and was one of critiques about the high volume studies demonstrating more hypertrophy compared to moderate. My stance always was that's very unlikely, especially when you talk about trained individuals. And we all do the pulse measurement 48 hours and 72 for one reason. But I understand the critique is valid because not too many studies following up 48, 72, 96 hours in trained cohorts. Study from my lab is acute, is under review now. We had was acute. We can't generalize beyond the study duration, but we had trained individuals. They were quite strong. They were randomized to do 7, 14, and 21 sets per session. Swelling went back with a 24 hours, regardless the condition. We had another study from the lab. When you did a repeated bout for the training technique, they were doing 10 sets to failure for pec that usually would swollen more than quads, for example. But when you measure 10 sets to failure, when you repeat 48 hours, no differences as well. And for the paper I mentioned with trained elderly, they were training for 1 year, then they underwent the intrasubject design, 18 sets per leg, and then they were split it, one leg keeping 18, the other 36. We have a multiple assessments for echo intensity. I also understand the issue with echo intensity, but nothing indicating swelling or damage after that. And one of the best predictors of, because swelling is just that acute hyperemia effect, the pump. And I think a lot of people misunderstand, especially on social media, when you talk about swelling and edema induced by muscle damage. Swelling goes back, if there is no damage, swelling, the studies I have been doing in the lab, it goes back 24 hours. If we have exercise inducing damage, that lasts longer, about 72 hours, some studies about 96. But very unlikely that people repeating the same workout, adjusting the load, would experience damage, inflating the measurements. And one of the best discriminant of damage, muscle strength. And we don't see high volume group gain less or losing strength post intervention. But we gotta do better, Doc. We gotta do more studies, and the critique was valid because a lot of people show me the data there. I know the data. We are working on that now, and now it's something I'm putting all my papers, the limitation. I'm dedicating way more time writing limitation sections. If you go to that one, Journal of Applied Physiology, I think it's 1 page. Because that applies to all the papers we do, almost. And now I mentioned replication and small study and sampling variance in the studies as a limitation. And hopefully we get more and more data to have a estimate close to the true effect, right? But yeah, that's great question and valid critique in my opinion. Although the data doesn't suggest that. Very unlikely again. Great question, guys. Thank you. Oh, my pleasure.
We have a lot more food, I think, so please eat more, take more. So, eat more, take more. Thank you everyone for coming. If there's anyone that needs to sign in,